Three. Hi, Bret.
Tom, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So I'm here today with my friend, New York Times columnist Bret Stephens. We've known each other for many years. We first met in Jerusalem in 2002, when Bret was appointed editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post when he was still aged only 28. A job he held until 2004 during the very fraught and difficult years of suicide bombings and the second Palestinian Intifada. Before that, Bret had worked at the Wall Street Journal in New York and Brussels for several years. And then after editing the Jerusalem Post, he returned to work for the Journal in New York as a senior foreign affairs columnist and later as the deputy editorial page editor. Bret won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2013. And then in 2017, he was snapped up by the New York Times when, at least at that time, the Times was interested in adding one or two more conservative voices to their, in my view, increasingly liberal left editorial pages. So, Bret, you spent, actually, let's start at the beginning. You spent much of your childhood growing up in Mexico City. How was that? And tell us a little bit about your family background and education in general.
Well, thank you. My father was born in Mexico to expatriated Jewish Americans. My grandmother was an artist who had gone to Mexico to work with painters like Diego Rivera and Orozco, painters she had met during their stay in the United States. My grandfather had gone down for business purposes and fallen in love with the country. So my father was born there, and there was a family business. And shortly after I was born, he took us down so that he would become a partner in his family business. It's a good thing to grow up as an American abroad, because I think it not only enhances your appreciation for the country in which you are being raised, it actually enhances your appreciation for the United States itself, because you see it as an outsider and you see virtues that aren't always apparent to those of us who, or to anyone who lives in the country.
And maybe growing up in Mexico is a key reason that you ended up as an opinion journalist, an editor. I mean, did you just fall into that? Or maybe you went to college, I think, in America. So maybe, when did you get interested in politics and opinion and so on?
Well, my father was very much a political animal. He had run for the United States Congress in 1974 as a Republican, the year that Nixon resigned. So he was not a good year for Republicans. But when I was a child, he actually wrote a weekly column for a Mexico City newspaper. So it's how I became aware of this thing called opinion journalism. Then when I was in college at the University of Chicago, sort of on a lark, I'd read a book which intrigued me, a book about anthropology, which had political overtones. And as a thought experiment, I wrote a book review of it, showed it to my dad, who said, "Oh, this is pretty good. Why don't you send it to Commentary Magazine?" Mm-hmm. So I sent it to them, as they say, over the transom. And to my astonishment, not only did they agree to run it, but they sent me a check for the princely sum of, I think, $350, which I thought was just a fortune. I took my girlfriend out to an expensive dinner in Chicago. And I couldn't quite get over the fact that not only did I get to see my name in print, but that I could be paid for it. So I guess after that, I was hooked.
Well, I mean, I believe probably Neil Kozlodoy was probably the editor of commentary at the time, and he was a tough, or maybe it was Podhoretz, but anyway, it was, for those who don't know, commentary has, it's hard to get into commentary at any age. And then, of course, you have worked for the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, which are arguably the two most important newspapers in America, although maybe the Washington Post will want to be included in that club. But let's just return to your punditry for a second. So how, over the years, how do you view America's place in the world, both over the years and today and moving forward?
Well, I should say something about my background on my mother's side.
Oh, yes, please.
My mother's family originally hails from Lithuania, from a distinguished family, rabbinical family named Grodzinski. and they were first refugees from Russia after the Bolsheviks. Then they were refugees from Germany after the Nazis came to power. My mother was born in Italy at the very beginning of World War II and was in a displaced person after the war. So the only place that they could ultimately call home is the United States. She arrived in America as a 10-year-old girl with $7 to her name. And so that emotional sense of America as a refuge runs very deep with me and with my entire family. So that's one way of viewing the United States. The other way, of course, is as a liberator, as the country that made the indispensable difference between the victory of the totalitarians in the 20th century and the victory of the free world. And I still see those two roles, refuge and liberator, as key to my sense of what America is all about at some level, and they shape my politics. I do not see any great force in the world today that can provide the world with the margin of safety, the margin between civilization and a rule of law versus barbarism. I see no other force other than the United States. The United Nations is incompetent at the task. I wouldn't want to see China or Russia or some of the so-called revisionist regimes muscling their way in. Unfortunately, I don't think the European Union has proved to be a particularly robust partner. And so it's kind of America or the deluge. And I still see that as kind of the centerpiece of my thinking, although I mean, I'm speaking very generally, and obviously one has to pick one's spots.
Yeah, and I just might add on two smaller sides, speaking as a European, I think many Europeans, I mean, to say the European Union has not been very robust is what we British call English understatement. And I think many of us in Europe would love the European Union, and indeed Britain now that it's out, to be more robust partners for democracy with the United States. But unfortunately, that has not been the case as much as we might have liked. And I also just want to add one small thing for those who might not be aware about your mother's Lithuanian background at the outset of World War II. I believe that Lithuania, more than any other country in Europe, the proportion of Jews murdered there by the Nazis and their local allies was higher in Lithuania than even in Germany itself. So in other words, your mother and her parents escaped by the scruff of the neck, both from Lithuania, and of course, if she was born in Italy during the beginning of the war, of course, that was also under fascist rule. So it wasn't a very safe place to be. So I think we're going to come on in a second now to the present president, Donald Trump. And I mention that also because some of those opposing Trump view him as maybe somehow being inspired, whether consciously or not, from some of those fascistic regimes of mid-century, 20th century Europe. And indeed, you yourself have very much been part of what's been dubbed Never Trumpers, in other words, the center-right opposition to Donald Trump's presidency. And maybe that's one of the reasons you left the Wall Street Journal for the New York Times shortly after Trump assumed office in 2017. But how do you view, look, well, just to timestamp this, we're in mid-October 2020. The election is in a couple of weeks. Trump is behind in the polls significantly. There's a good chance he won't be president in a short time. But whether or not he's ousted or indeed beats the odds and stays in office, how do you view the Trump period for America's place in the world?
I think it's been a doleful period in that Trump has very self-consciously retreated from those two conceptions of the United States that I, in particular, and for personal reasons as well, hold dear. The number of refugees that the United States accepts every year has diminished substantially. demagoguery when it comes to immigrants has gone way up. I think Trump really didn't understand what America First was historically when he adopted the slogan, but the essence of it is very much the same. The sense that we have no broader obligation than to ourselves as a country, I think is hard-hearted and short-sighted, in that the United States does best when it is defending liberty at the farther frontier of the world, whether it's along the 38th parallel in Korea or in West Berlin during the Cold War, then it does so with this kind of cramped vision of his, of walls at the Rio Grande and fences in Canada. So in all those senses, I see Trump as a kind of betrayer, if you will. Maybe betray is the wrong word, but as someone who speaks for a kind of a blood and soil version of America that I find difficult to recognize. And it's one of the reasons why, despite the fact that from time to time he pursues policies with which I agree, sometimes very emphatically, that agreement is more coincidental than it is profound. And it's why I'm just simply unable to support him, even though I remain pretty much a center-right figure with deep misgivings about the direction of the Democratic Party.
Yes, I mean, do you think, is it possible, leaving aside Trump's very particular personality for one moment, is it some say that a kind of retreat of America from the world began under the previous administration of Barack Obama, perhaps in response to overreach by the administration before that of George W. Bush and in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on? Is it possible this sort of, they wouldn't use the term America First, but this putting America First policy may still be with us moving forward, much as you may think it's unwise and unfortunate? Is it very much tied in with Trump, or do you think future government, future American presidents and administrations will be more robust in the world?
Well, it's an excellent question. In fact, in 2014, I wrote a book called America in Retreat, subtitled The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder. And historians will actually see more continuity, at least in substance, between Obama and Trump, however much there is a difference in style. I mean, Obama talked about nation building at home. He talked about diminishing, or I think resizing was the term, America's footprint. He also had a view of the United States that it should tend to its problems at home and leave the rest of the world to itself. And this is not a new phenomenon in American history. From the Republican administrations of the 1920s through the early part of the Roosevelt administration up until the late 1930s, the United States was also an explicitly or implicitly isolationist nation. This is part of a phenomenon that Henry Kissinger, I think, very aptly described as a disastrous oscillation in American foreign policy between overcommitment and isolation. And obviously, you don't want to move to either extreme. But in this case with Trump, we've moved, I think, too much to the, at least ideologically, rhetorically, to the isolationist extreme. The practice of his foreign policy has been a little bit different than the rhetoric, but in some ways the rhetoric counts for more because it's planted the seed in the American mind that the rest of the world's troubles should never be our own. And I'm not saying that they should be our own because we have to carry the burdens of the world, but there are some cases in which disorder, anarchy, and threats in places like Syria, Iran, Northeast Asia, and so on, carry direct implications for the security of Americans in the center of the country.
Yeah. Is there, I mean, leaving aside his personality again, is there something that Trump in foreign policy has got right. I mean, the very first act almost he did as president was to take a congratulatory phone call from the president, I think it is, of Taiwan, and he was criticized as a kind of ignoramus, but I thought at the time, and it seems even more so now, it was deliberate to maybe act tough over China. And he's also, concluded some peace deals. They're not the biggest ones in history, but you've got Kosovo and Serbia, you've got Israel with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and maybe more coming up. So, I mean, Barack Obama, as far as I'm aware, most of his so-called peace initiatives with Iran, with Cuba, with Burma, Libya, intervention in Libya, none of them have turned out very well. Is it possible that, leaving aside his personality and rhetoric and so on, Trump has more foreign policy achievements than the last president or the last couple of presidents?
Well, there's an argument you can make. I had a fairly low view of the record of the Obama administration. I was an astringent critic of the Iran nuclear deal. I thought the so-called reset with Russia, I argued from almost the first day, was a disaster. I think John Kerry's mediation efforts between Israelis and Palestinians were a fool's errand, which turned out to be exactly the case. So sort of judging Trump by Obama's foreign policy standards actually makes Trump look comparatively better. And as a never Trumper, this is a term that it's a label that ends up sticking. I've tried in my columns to be fair to him. I've tried never to be sort of blinded by a personal prejudice against the man to some legitimate triumphs. I said so only a few weeks ago about the so-called Abraham Accords between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. I think they're a significant achievement. I think getting out of the Iran nuclear deal was at least the beginning of a better policy for the United States. The point you make about Taiwan is correct, but let's look at other things. Let's look, for instance, at his attempts to ingratiate himself with North Korea at the expense of military exercises with the South. That's a disaster. Withdrawing the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a victory for China. His periodic outreach to Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who I see as the kind of new Khomeini of the Middle East, is another misjudged idea. The attempt to withdraw from Syria and leave the Kurds to their fate, again, another disaster. The disinterest in the fate of Hong Kong or of the Uyghur people in China, again, deeply misbegotten. The effort to withdraw from Afghanistan, which is going to leave us pretty much where we were before 9/11, also deeply misbegotten. So, again, I'm trying to be fair and keep a sense of my own principles without just despising everything that Trump has done. And by the way, I should add, because of this connection between us, I said at the beginning, and I continue to say, that moving the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was absolutely the right thing to do, and it's been vindicated by history.
So Bret, I just want to tie 2 or 3 questions together so you can answer them in one go. Firstly, I think most people can agree that Trump has been over the top on many occasions and, downright vulgar in some of his tweets and so on. Yet some of the criticism of Trump may also have been over the top, in my view anyway. I think you yourself compared Trump to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and others have gone further and compared him to Hitler. I'm talking about friends of mine who are journalists openly on their Facebook feeds and so on that I see, comparing Trump to Hitler and so on. And is that itself a form of danger? Because a lot of, especially younger people, are very ignorant of fascism and Nazism. And as bad as Trump might have been, I myself don't think anything has touched on fascism or so on. And I think it's in a way dangerous to water down what, if I can put it that way, what real fascism or Nazism was. And I just want to tie that into one other thing. Right now, there's a kind of culture war going on in America and much of the West. Part of that We've seen things like the toppling of statues, some of the more extreme people jumping onto the Black Lives Matter movement. And also at your very newspaper, the New York Times, they've been promoting this 1619 project. So if I can just tie all those things together, I know they're not quite related, to look at where Trump and the opposition to Trump might fit in with the sort of ongoing culture war and use of language and so on in discourse today.
Well, I'd have to go back to the article I wrote for the Wall Street Journal with the comparison to Mussolini. I'm fairly sure I was a little more nuanced than simply saying that he's another fascist dictator. And the comparisons between Trump and Hitler are absurd and even obscene. But there is a kind of a style to Trump, a disregard, a sort of persistent disregard for questions of veracity, a willingness to kind of come down from his position in the White House to, I mean, he called Never-Trumpers human scum, just to give you an example. Those aren't just rhetorical flourishes. That is a kind of signature setting for the United States presidency. There is unmistakably in his version of conservatism, much more of the Marine Le Pen style of nationalism and protectionism and xenophobia than there is of the Margaret Thatcher style of opportunity and the smaller state and the free world. So, while we have to, I think you're absolutely right that the left has been treated Trump as the second coming of a fascist dictator when he's more of a kind of nativist buffoon. The right shouldn't be blind to the fact that Trump's personal style is not only dangerous in itself, but it creates a template for some future Trump-like figure who may be a little more wily and willful and conniving and capable than Trump. And I think that we're fools to ignore that. I mean, during the 1990s, conservatives used to like to talk about the importance of character in the White House and how it set an example for the country. Well, here we are. Now, as for the left, I couldn't agree more, Tom. We have a left that used to be, at least during the Clinton years, moving toward the center of the country. Now, increasingly, it's a left that bends towards its own fringe. The inability of sections of the left, this is hardly all of the left, but the inability of sections of the left to squarely denounce things like toppling statues of George Washington and even Ulysses Grant and Abraham Lincoln is shameful. Countries that renounce the best aspects, even if they're sometimes flawed aspects of their history, aren't countries that do particularly well. There is a kind of left-wing censorious quasi-fascism, or I don't want to say fascism, but fascistic attitude.
Maybe Stalinist, since that comes from the left rather than fascism in a way, kind of quasi-Stalinist.
Well, yes, it's not quite Stalinist, but it's
cancel culture. I mean, like shutting down debate and so on.
It's cancel culture. It's the nastiness of the so-called Bernie Bros. It is a kind of it's a little bit like the hard left of the late 1960s. That wasn't. That was not just simply trying to win an argument. It was trying to destroy and besmirch its opponents. And that's really problematic, especially when it's tied to an ambitious agenda to once again bring back Mother State as a principal actor in the American economy. So for those of us who are neither of the Trumpian right nor of this far left, it feels a little bit like being a soldier who's kind of gotten stuck in no man's land during the First World War. It's kind of finding himself worried about artillery from both sides of the lines. but in a sense, I think it's the only honest and honorable place to be. And one day I hope that the Republican Party recovers its senses and adopts the kind of Reagan-esque, optimistic, inclusive vision of the world that was what inspired me as a kid to sort of lean more to the right. But until it does, I think my privilege as a columnist is just to call them as I see them. And if that means that readers are never going to be, never going to find me fully on their side, well, my purpose isn't to be their spokesman. My purpose is to try to think out loud in a coherent and challenging fashion.
I mean, vis-a-vis your point about the increasingly extreme right and increasingly extreme left, was it Henry Kissinger who said of the Iran-Iraq war, can't both sides lose? Or have I got the wrong person? Maybe it wasn't Kissinger.
No, well, it is often attributed to Kissinger. I don't know if he wants ownership of the quote, because of course many people died in that war. But yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that at some point in the future, we can have a Democratic Party which believes in capitalism, believes in the American cause and the spirit, but wants a somewhat fairer society, and a Republican Party that believes in the same things, but wants a slightly freer society, at least economically speaking. And between those, sorry to use an American metaphor, between the 40-yard lines of the ideological spectrum, you can find your way towards kind of balance and sense and steadiness. But what you now have is something in which each party is moving much farther to the right or much farther to the left than they have in decades, maybe even closer to a century. I don't think that's good for Americans. I don't think that's good for the world. The world can't afford for its leading nation to lose its head. And that's where it sometimes seems we're going.
And just to finish off, one more question, if I might ask about, you've worked, as I said, at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Is there a difference in the culture of working in these two media institutions, and specifically with the Times? My impression is that it's shifting like much of the American left. It's also being tugged, at least by some of its writers and editors, and indeed your boss, in a sense, James Bennett, who hired you as the Times editorial page editor, was kind of forced out along with one of your fellow columnists earlier this year. Is there, how would you rate, is it, I mean, feel free to answer this how you want to, but I, for one, I'm a bit worried that the New York Times, which is a very important media outlet, should be too partisan or too pulled in one direction. But you may disagree, I don't know.
Well, no, I agree. I think it's important that, the Times is America's newspaper of record. There's no question of that. And one of the things that struck me when I moved from the Journal to the Times is just how much larger an operation the Times is, not only in terms of the number of journalists it employs, but really in terms of the reach that the Times has. When I was at the Journal, I thought we were comparative, more or less the same size as the Times. That was a mistake. The Times is just a much larger newspaper, and I think my role there is to provide some of the counterballast, if you will, that the paper not only needs but acknowledges that it needs, because the paper has in fact always been a liberal paper. It has always tilted left. And so when people tell me, well, how can you work at the New York Times? You disagree with so much of what they stand for, or what they say. I guess my question in response is, well, would you rather have me not at the New York Times? Would you rather not have that counterballast? And so that's the role I think, at least the one that I'm trying to play. I think it's important. I think, and I think, by the way, Tom, that there is a silent, I don't know if it's a silent majority, but there is a silent constituency of readers at the Times who are not hyper woke, hyper left, who can handle the challenge of a good argument from the other side, who can occasionally take a contrary point of view. And I think for those readers, I provide some, I don't know if it's solace, but I provide something valuable. I hope, at any rate.
You certainly do. Can I just add one final thing about my dear father, who worked at the New York Times for a number of years in the 1980s on the culture and book desk. Even then, it definitely tilted left. And my father wasn't very political. He was a moderate, centrist kind of figure. So he was reviewing a book, the title of which was The Soviet Invasion of Afghanistan, or at least it had the word invasion. And my father was not allowed to use the word invasion as part of his book review. They've changed it to intervention because they said that the communist government in Kabul had invited the Soviet Union in, and therefore it was an intervention, not an invasion. So it's not necessarily new, some of this woke politics at the New York Times, we're talking 30 years ago, but nevertheless, you of course play a very important, very important voice, both at the New York Times and in the world of opinion punditry in general. And thank you very much anyway for being with us today. Have you any parting thought or?
No, well, thank you for 30 minutes of very thought-provoking conversation. One of the pleasures of these talks is that they seed ideas for future columns. I know many of the people who follow you, Tom, are sort of view the New York Times as the kind of centerpiece of all evil in the world and ideology.
I have lots of New York Times fans too, but yes.
So, well, I just want to. I'm glad to hear that, because I want to push back a little bit. I have the privilege of working with some extraordinarily talented colleagues, some of whom take immense personal risks to bring readers a picture of what's going on in far-flung corners of the world, and have nothing but admiration for them. And I think that's always worth pointing out.
No, indeed, and I should just point out, with the New York Times, also The Guardian in Britain, it's a great pity that a lot of their wonderful coverage is slightly obscured by some rather extreme voices, both in the opinion and also the news pages that find their way into the Times and Guardian. That's my view. That it's not a view that I don't have the view the New York Times is a bad paper. I want it to be a better paper with more voices like yourself, and I want it to be moderated when in its general criticism, whether it's of Israel or of the United States itself or of Britain or wherever.
Tom, it's a pleasure chatting.
Yes. Okay. Have a good day. Bye.